Hi, everyone, and welcome to the next Strategy Skills podcast episode. And we've got quite a treat today. Well, both a bakery treat and the treat in terms of who we're interviewing. We're going to speak to Robert Rosenberg, who, while not the official founder of Dunkin Donuts, he is the man who made Dunkin Donuts what it is today. And what's fascinating about this episode is that typically when we speak to a CEO or a partner, we're speaking to someone and we're talking about the work they're doing currently. We're talking about the insights they have. We're talking about the successes they have. But those successes have not been adjudicated through the lens of the test of time. I mean, we don't know how some of these concepts, insights, and ideas are going to sound and withstand 20, 30 years of scrutiny. That's why today's episode is interesting. Because Robert Rosenberg, quite a character, was running Dunkin Donuts since I think it was 1963 when he was appointed at the age of 25 leadership of the family business, which eventually he built up into as Dunkin Donuts. A graduate of Cornell University and the Harvard Business School, class of 1963, he's also quite unusual in having used consultants from a very, very early age. I mean, when I speak to CEOs of growing businesses, relatively smaller growing businesses from that period, most of them don't use management consultants. But Robert was unusual in this regard. Dunkin Donuts is now a ubiquitous company across the world, very successful business. So you're going to speak to someone who was able to grow the business through a compound annual rate of return of 35% until it went public, which is a remarkable achievement. The other thing that makes this episode unusual is that when we talk about businesses, when we talk to CEOs and partners, we're typically talking about businesses that have employees and suppliers. And we look at how they create wealth for their employees, for their shareholders, and for their suppliers. But we never really speak to businesses that have franchisees or franchises. And it's something that has been the bedrock of wealth creation in America. It's still a significant part of the US economy today, especially since the US economy is so service-driven and driven by restaurants, tourism, and hospitality, and so on. But now we have a chance to speak to someone who has built one of the most successful franchise operations in the world. The other thing I like, which you will see, is that, until recently, this concept of learning from other nations, other cultures, was not a big part of corporate America. I mean, 1980s, 1970s, America thought it had nothing to learn from the rest of the world. But Robert will show you examples whereby some of the best ideas that Dunkin Donuts created came from foreign operations in other countries. Changes to the business model came from foreign operations in other countries. Innovation wasn't centralized, but came through ideas percolating through the different franchisees. In some cases, the wives of franchisees. I think that's quite remarkable. I mean, the story that I particularly liked was hearing how one immigrant from one part of the world, whether it's Puerto Rico or Spain or wherever it is, would come to the United States, work in a Dunkin Donuts as a dishwasher or cook, spend a lot of time and money working hard, saving, opening their own franchise, and then encouraging other members of the community who have either come to the United States or want to come to the United States to join them, and then over time start their own franchises. And in some cases, giving the members of the community money to set up their franchises. I mean, it's a powerful example of the community structure of the business, and for lack of a better word, how this leads to wealth creation. Capitalism at its best. So I enjoyed this episode. Robert's a great guy. I'm sure you're going to like the conversation. So let's get straight into it. Welcome, Bob. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So it's interesting to have you on the call. And there's many places to start because, Dunkin Donuts is a universal brand. But I have an interesting story for you. The first time I ever visited the United States, many, many years ago, right? And I arrived in New York City because that's where everyone wants to go when they visit New York. And I walk into my first store is a Dunkin Donuts store. And I remember thinking, I was just amazed at how perfect every donut was. It's like someone had crafted them all to look exactly the same, to be perfect with all these little colors and so on. So I thought it's an interesting thing because I'm interviewing you as the guy that built Dunkin Donuts, and that's my first experience in the United States.
Not a bad experience, I would say.
Not a bad experience, right? So,
Right.
in reading it's sort of a pseudo memoir. One of the things that struck me is whenever I'm interviewing or talking to CEOs or senior partners, we always tend to have a discussion about the employees and the suppliers. That's where it invariably goes. But in your book, we talk about building businesses for franchisees. And you talk about the story of Tony and Manny Andrade, and I think it's Johnny and Rosie Appaducci, about how these guys started with nothing. And I think one of them retired with 50 million or something like that in Palm Beach.
Absolutely. Franchising is often misunderstood. It basically is seen as either a very large business by people because they see lots of outlets, but it's really comprised of a network of small business people, many of whom start most modestly years ago.
Yeah.
The typical Dunkin' Donut franchisee spent about $25,000 in those days. I'm going back now 30, 40 years to buy their franchise. And they built a wonderful livelihood for themselves. And it's a wonderful combination of combining the skills and the resources of a brand owner and brand builder with the entrepreneurial skills of someone on premise who has skin in the game. It dramatically reduces the risk of failure for the franchisee, and for the franchisor, it provides a terrific extension of great online frontline managers to help represent their brand. And today, those little acorns, in some cases, have grown into massive oaks. There are people that have spun that one store that they started with into networks of hundreds of stores. So it was not only an opportunity for an individual and a family to have a good livelihood and a great way to sort of express the American dream, but it also became a vehicle for some of them to grow dramatically large and to build, quite truthfully, estates worth tens of millions of dollars. That's a little understood fact.
Yes,
most people.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is how these guys started. I mean, some of them started as washing dishes, but doing the most basic work and saving and saving and saving, and then investing in one store, repeating the process. And they were not doing anything incredibly smart. They were just following the basics of smart investing. And then the other thing that struck me is that a lot of them were family businesses, pulling in their aunts, uncles, brothers, and when they ran out of family members, they were then helping the employees by seeding them with loans, which I thought was pretty amazing.
Absolutely. That's a lot of them grew very internally. Some of them came from the Azores. Yes. And when they ran out of family, they had other village folks. After there was a big volcanic eruption on one of the islands in the Azores, so people were hard pressed to find a livelihood. So they were open to move. Oftentimes they moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, or Fall River, or Providence. And it was from that we built hundreds upon hundreds of stores from those communities. Hard workers, very family-oriented, terrific people. And that was the basis of a lot of our franchise growth.
It's like the principle of compounding interest. It's about you take little steps each day to save, and it snowballs and snowballs and snowballs. And before you know it, some of these guys have 50 to 100 stores, and they're doing very well.
Well, part of that was also, excuse me, I have to cut that over edit. Part of that, it was also the ability of the company to keep evolving over time, how we went to market. So it was a combination of their entrepreneurialism and our ability to keep redesigning the business to make it more and more effective and more profitable as the years went on.
So let's just step back for a second, right? We're in this time where everyone's questioning whether capitalism works, whether it's broken. But you have got some pretty good examples where we see capitalism is working. What do you think were some of the things that worked well for Dunkin' Donuts to keep growing in a way that took care of its franchisees so well?
Fundamentally, we focused on really three things. I call them 3 Ps. We focused on planning. We were very good planners. We focused on people, and we focused on product. We were very committed to having the very best product available. And it was a commitment to those activities over decades that allowed us to be able to adjust to an ever-changing competitive landscape, an ever-changing consumer. And I would say that at the root of it, that ability to focus on those activities were essential to enable us to grow.
One of the things I noticed is that you were very open to bringing in an external viewpoint. And I noticed that you used consultants very early. For example, I think you used A.D. Little to look at a process for making some changes with donuts. But where does that come from, this willingness to bring in external viewpoints?
I'm not quite sure where it comes from, but fundamentally, I guess we believed as a management team that we had to keep reaching out for experts wherever we could and to be open to change, and we were highly adaptable. And we basically had a team culture, and we were sort of outward looking.
Yes.
We saw essential to the planning process was a real commitment to define reality. And that's easy to say, but sometimes very hard to do. And that requires input from a lot of different places and from a lot of travel and a lot of listening. And you can get it from different sources, sometimes from franchise owners. They themselves provided a lot of input. Sometimes it came from consultants. Sometimes it came from books and seminars. Sometimes it came from competitors.
Mm-hmm.
And that was I guess it was inbred in us to be open to that kind of influence. And I suspect that in order to do good planning, in order to be able to define reality, that's a continuing conscious effort required to do that. So,
yes.
And we had some good results and we had some bad results. And we had BCG help us with terrific results. The Arthur D. Little experience, not so good, and I ascribe that to the fact that we really didn't define the issues properly. We were too prescriptive.
Yes.
And it didn't work out well, but we've had very good results and not so good results using consultants. So we also used McKinsey. When I took over basketball, I was later ahead of the story, but basically they were extraordinarily helpful. So it's been a combination of being a good client and also being a good consultant. Make sure that you're focusing on the right question.
Yes.
And as a client, don't be too prescriptive would be my lesson.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's a story in there, I forget exactly where, but it's, I think in the 1970s, where you guys did some work with MIT, or you brought someone in from MIT and you were building a financial model for the first time to project margins and so on. I thought that was interesting because we take all those technologies for granted, but we forget the impact early automation had on businesses.
Very much so for us. That was one of the key elements of our planning process. It was actually the head of our IT department, who was an MIT graduate. While I was in business school, while I was in graduate school, I remembered there was at the time, a new process developed by someone by the name of Jay Forrester, which was the ability to put your business, major assumptions, on a computer and run lots of different iterations with varying assumptions. And at the time, this fellow, Tom Johnson, who was head of our IT department, when we went to him and asked him if he could do that for us in response to a question one of my board members asked of me about whether we could slow down our rate of growth.
Yes.
And sure enough, Tom came back and said, absolutely, I can do that. And it was as if a lightning bolt went off, because we now had the ability to answer the director's questions much more effectively than we had by my just relying upon a gut feeling about whether or not the strategic alternative he was proposing really worked or not. And that was a core part of our planning for years, for decades, was our ability to be able to use that model. And on the basis of 4 or 5 assumptions, we could predict with immense accuracy, where we were likely to go.
Yeah, I always found reading it is how, I would say, how much, I wouldn't say risk-taking, but how much innovation was being applied to sort of the hospitality, fast food, retail space. Because when most people think about Dunkin Donuts or any franchise business, we don't normally assume they're at the cutting edge of management practices.
I'd be honest, in the 1960s when I first started, I think that was true. That's not true today.
Yes.
It's a highly sophisticated industry with executives every bit as sophisticated as in other industries. But the industry has gone through what I would call 3 distinct phases. The first one was just after the Second World War when it started. They were basically operators, people who could develop a concept and were committed to product quality. The second phase came in maybe a decade or 2 later, when pretty much pioneered by McDonald's and a fellow by the name of Fred Turner, added on to that. They didn't lose the operational components, but they added on and grafted on basically the ability to be able to market. And they began to import first-class Procter & Gamble style marketing initiatives and product managers, lots of research, understanding the consumer. And that carried and separated different companies over time. And then the third phase that we're in now was basically the digitization of technology. Those companies that were able to keep the strong operational orientation, not lose that, graft on first-rate marketing, and then also move into really progressive, big investments in IT. So you're now at the same stage as almost every other industry and company. They're competing with the latest in technology. And that's how some of these companies have pivoted so successfully during the COVID crisis, by virtue of their ability to be able to rely on digitization.
Yeah, but what that means is, I suppose, is that if you are looking to enter this industry or similar industries, there's almost a hurdle of capabilities you need to have access to, like this management skills. And if you don't have it, you're at some major disadvantage.
I think that's true. I would agree with that.
Yeah, so if you're starting off now in this space and you don't have all of that learning, and you don't have some big private equity firm backing you to buy that learning, it's going to be difficult to compete, right?
Yes, I think so. And I think that when the dust settles, an awful lot of platforms that we see growing successfully today by virtue of the pandemic is also working in the food service industry. Those companies that have resources and have the capability to be able to provide those seamless interfaces with the consumer on the telephone, as opposed to independents and startups, are the ones that are going to capture a lion's share of the business. And I think that's true. It's going to increasing. It just speeds that whole process up.
So shifting gears a little bit, I like the story of Munchkins. Do you remember that one about what to do with the middle of the donuts and about the franchisee and his wife who figure out a way? But I liked the example of how you were looking at drawing in ideas from outside of the core leadership team, innovating by inclusion. It's a different way to think about how to innovate versus having these central R&D departments.
Absolutely. Good ideas come from a number of places, particularly from franchisees. This was actually a husband and wife team that operated a few stores in Hartford, Connecticut.
Yeah.
The wife's name was Edna Demery.
Yeah.
And I got a call one day from Bob Demery, who was a friend, someone I knew well. I remember, I started when the company was small, so I knew an awful lot of the initial franchisees. And he was excited. He was on the phone. He said, "You got to come down and see what Edna has created."
Yeah. And
she has created a whole new thing with donut holes. And I said, "Oh my God, donut holes are something we've had since I was a kid." Yeah. When I used to work in the stores with you, Bob Demery, we used to take the centers out of the donuts around Halloween time and put them in these cellophane bags and put them in these potato chip holders because we thought it was a good trick-or-treat item. So it was sold for a week or two around Halloween. He said, "Oh, no, this is not what we did." Edna developed a new cutter, and she did 1/5 of a donut in each cutter, and she found a way to fill them, frost them, sugar them, and she piled them high in the front display showcase, and our business is up 20%. I've never seen anything like it. Well, it was so exciting. We all got in the car the next day, 3 of us, and drove down to Hartford, and sure enough, here were these gorgeous donut munchkin treats. They weren't called munchkins at the time. These little treats in the showcase, and they were going out like hotcakes. And basically, we knew right then and there that we had a winner. It was in the middle. This was in the early 70s, in the middle of the gas line shortages and closing. Sunday. Yeah. The government, I think, closed down different businesses on Sunday. Wage and price controls in Nixon's administration. It was a tough time, and we introduced this product. We named it. We went through a couple of names. We finally ended on the Wizard of Oz, little people that appeared every year. I think CBS ran it annually. Munchkins and the Wizard of Oz, and we packaged them up either individually, could buy packages of 10, 20, and buckets of 30, and it was a phenomenal success. And an otherwise dreadful year, we had same-store sales, which is the key measurement of retail business. How do you do this the same period this year against the period last year? For the year, we were up 12%, which was a huge victory in a retail business. And any retail business that can be up 12% has really had a winning strategy, a lot of good news. And it's been a wonderful product. It's still in existence all these years later. It's now almost 50 years that the product's been in existence, and it's still a terrific seller.
So what happened to the middle of a donut before Munchkins?
Donuts are made, they really are basically four mixes. So there's a cake and yeast mix. And what happens, they have something called first cut. So when you take a cake dough, which is leavened by baking powder, you roll it out, and you have a cutter, and you cut the donuts by hand. And at least we did in years by. They now have good semi-automatic pieces of equipment that do that even better. But you cut that out, and you're left with what they call scrap. And you mix the scrap into the second cuts, and those cuts that you make may be crullers or other things. Because when you mix it again, you toughen the dough somewhat. When you do the same thing with the yeast dough. You cut rings, which are the big honey-dipped round donuts, frosted. And the second cut are shells that are a little bit tougher because you rework the dough. And the third cuts are basically used for what we call fancies, which are coffee rolls and bear claws and all of these other kinds of fancy donuts that we make out of the third cuts. So always before this time, we would roll back in the holes back into the next cut. And no one thought about maybe just rolling it out and developing a new cutter just for the holes, and then finishing them with jelly and lemon and apple and all of the delicious.
Oh, you're making me hungry here, Bob.
Yeah, and merchandising them, except until Edna Demery figured that out and found a way to take an existing part of the process and create a brand new, multi-million-dollar product.
When you listen to the story, it sounds like it's a small thing. But, as you know very well, in operation strategy, simply reducing the setup costs once or twice can rip out millions and millions of dollars of costs.
Absolutely.
So, you've got this millions of donuts being sold, and you find a way to simplify the process, and you find a way to reduce costs and create revenue. It's a big win, right?
Yes, it is. It is.
So let's.
And that was just the beginning of others, because we've had other serendipitous episodes brought to our attention by franchise owners in a new way to go to market that were even more dramatic in terms of changing the business.
Sorry, you were saying?
Well, I could go in the 80s, and that was in the 70s. In the 80s, basically a trip to the Philippines.
Yeah, that's a good story.
Had an even more dramatic effect.
Let's talk about that. I actually like that story.
Well, basically, we had sold the license in the Philippines to two families, the Prietos and the Spakowskis. Spakowskis had a home in Hartford, but Mrs. Spakowski was Filipino, and basically her husband had met her, I guess, during the Second World War. The other family were the Prietos, an old Spanish family, and Leo Prieto actually spoke for the partnership. And they had opened up a very successful store in Manila, in Makati, which is the upscale neighborhood in Manila. But they had then begun to start to sell donuts and coffee in other places. They were taking the product and distributing it in convenience stores and in gas stations and in theaters. In those days, our advertising campaign was Fred the Baker, who would say, I bet supermarket donuts do this. We make our donuts fresh everywhere. So on my trip to the Orient, I had to stop in the Philippines and tell the franchisee, you can't do that. That's not how we go to market. We basically make product on premise and sell it on premise. We don't move it around. Lo and behold, when I get there, I come to find out the business of distributing to all these places are by the wives of the board members of the franchise. The Prietos and the Spakowskis have taken in some of the wealthier, better connected residents of Manila.
Yeah.
And their wives were using their household help to take product. If you ever go to Manila, you would, at least years ago when I used to go, there were little jitneys, little bicycles, motorized bicycles that go around. They were putting product and distributing it in all of these locations off the jitneys. And Leo Prieto, when I went there to stop the practice, he knew I was coming to do that. Didn't engage me in conversation. But we had some parties. We were opening up a small distribution center, some other things where I officiated. And we had a dinner to recognize employees. That was a lovely dinner. And he sat me between two of these lovely Filipino women who were wives. And they began to tell me the success that they were having and how much money they were making on these points of distribution. And I didn't have the heart to say, no, we have to stop then and there. And I was on my way to other parts of the Orient at the time. And I remember being on the plane with Tom Shores, the CEO of the company, my longtime business partner, and basically saying, what would happen if we converted our business and how we went to market? And we did this. As half of our store now is basically we're spending 2,000 square feet. Half of it is kitchen.
Yeah.
What if we spun out of this kitchen additional points of distribution, traded on our name, and got even more brand identity in the markets we were in? And what would the world look like, and how would we do it? And lo and behold, as a result of that trip and the lives of the board members, we redefined how we go to market. We decided that we wouldn't sell just on premise, that we take our product to wherever people shop, work, travel, to play. And it was a kind of a lightning bolt again that must have been like what Coca-Cola went through when they decided that they would put their product in a bottle and start to distribute it everywhere as opposed to just selling it at a soda fountain. And it unraveled unleashed a whole way of going to market that enhanced the return on investment, which is the critical benchmark of scalability for these businesses, dramatically, and set us off in a whole new brand new direction that really spelled a big difference in how our business grew.
What I like about, there's a couple of things that I like about the story that I want to unpack. The first one I think is a testament to you, Bob, is the fact that this idea did not originate in the United States, right? This was a time when Americans, or maybe Americans still think this way, but it's a time when American businesses led the world. They still do to a large degree, but here's an idea from the Philippines. And I think a lot of executives would just dismiss this and say, well, it's not an American idea. What do these guys know about it? But you went with the idea rather than dismissing it out of hand. And I think that's a very unusual part of this story, because you very rarely see practices from outside the United States being adopted within the United States. It's very rare.
In our case, a good idea is a good idea. We don't care where it comes from. We're not too proud to be able to change, adapt, and adjust. And we did that. In the same era, we had other franchisees, two of them in particular, decided to change the way we sold our product. We had traditionally sold coffee and donuts.
Yes.
And we sold our coffee on premise in a 6-ounce porcelain cup.
Yeah.
And our standard store was a 20-seat counter in every store. They all looked the same. Mm-hmm. And the franchisee in Natick, Massachusetts and Fairfield, Connecticut simultaneously said, I think that we should try going to self-service. And we should eliminate the counter and the dishwasher.
Yeah.
And we should sell everything in paper cups. And we should basically eliminate the noise, people inside the restaurants that might have been smoking in those days. And we could create a better environment. And we allowed them to experiment and to carry out their idea. And lo and behold, we found that there too, it was a superior way to go to market, a better way to merchandise. And we converted all of our distribution that way. And slowly but surely, the balance of trade, the mix that we sold in the stores changed dramatically as well. We went from primarily being a bakery, a donut shop with muffins and other products to basically a beverage business. As a result of that, we weren't aware of that at the time. It was kind of an unintended consequence. But there too, our business changed dramatically as a result of an innovation, and we immediately changed the way we outfitted our stores. What we call a service delivery system changed. And that changed our business as well. And that's another development that came really at the initiation of franchise owners.
You said something very important here, and I think this applies to businesses in general. A lot of good ideas are the results of unintended consequences. And a big part of management's job is to create an environment whereby you can, there's a channel whereby you learn about those unintended consequences and you create a space for them to be nurtured. Otherwise, how do you know these things will exist, right?
I couldn't agree more. In other words, we were very, very good planners, and we were very thorough planners, and planning carried out throughout the width and breadth of the organization. A lot of management by objectives, but we also left room for emergent strategies, things that occurred that we could change. And it was a combination of both. There's an awful lot of that serendipity that occurs in life and in business.
Yes.
And I think we were aware of that, and we were open to that. And it worked out absolutely wonderfully for us. I can't stress it strongly enough this willingness to be open to these ideas really spelled a huge difference in the outcome of the business. And I'm sure it carries on to this very day.
And going back to the Filipino example, I like the insight that you guys came up with where you said that previously a franchise was awarded to a location, but then you shifted back and started awarding a franchise for a region with the support and plan for how to grow that region.
That all came as a result of the Filipino experience. In other words, we then stopped issuing it for an individual store. We started to issue it. We gave 2 licenses. One was a development agreement for 3 to 5 years in terms of allowing the franchisee to develop a lot of satellite locations, we call them, around the manufacturer of the production store. And they were then buying a small network as opposed to an individual store. And the return on investment on that franchise operation went from maybe 12 to 15% to something closer to 15 to 20%. And it was a significant difference. And it unleashed our rate of growth tripled, quadrupled as a result of that. And that's when franchisees, the franchise went from buying a nice lifestyle for a franchise owner and his family to being a huge wealth creator. Yes. Now people had the opportunity to create huge networks. And it was a result of just that change in this, both in the service delivery system and the change of how we went to market.
Yeah, what I like about the story is because we tend to be in business, media, just general pop culture, obsessed with kind of leaders, personified by a Steve Jobs type person who leads from the top and tells people what to do. And a lot of companies try to emulate that. But what the story shows is that a lot of times your best ideas come from the bottom and got to percolate up, which then forces the company to adapt. And it's a different model, but it's a very good model if you think about it.
I agree with you, but I think you have to be sort of true to your own style as a leader. In my case, when I came out of business school and I took over the business at age 25, I was more comfortable with a collegial, collaborative style of leadership. I never thought of myself as someone coming in on a white horse with all the answers.
Yeah.
And we developed just a team culture, and we considered franchisees and staff members and employees, everybody was part of that team. And as a result of that sort of team orientation, any teammate really could make a contribution and we welcomed them and saw them as part of the team. And I think some of it has to be just what you're comfortable with. Certain people are comfortable with command and control, and other people are much more comfortable with a much more collaborative style. In my case, it was just natural. I can't say I studied it or came with a direct intention. It was just the way I felt more comfortable. I was comforted by my teammates, the management team around me, the 10 or 15 senior people. We were together for decades. Mm-hmm. We had different backgrounds and different educational levels, but we all respected each other. We sort of understood the nature of complementarity, that no one person had all the answers, that each person had a contribution to make. And I think that expressed itself all the way through the organization. It was just our style.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit, right? I mean, you were there running Dunkin' Donuts for 30 odd years. That's a very long tenure.
It is.
I mean, I don't know many executives who have run anything in corporate America for 30 years. I'm thinking, but none come to mind, at least not for major companies the size of Dunkin' Donuts. So let's just talk about that a little bit, right? You assembled your leadership team, and obviously you had to change your leadership team and so on. What do you think would be the advice you would give people who want to have a long tenure as a leader at any level?
Well, I think, first of all, I had an unusual beginning. I got my opportunity at 25 right out of school because my father had been the founder of the business.
So the first lesson is start early.
That's unique. And I did. I put in my 10,000 hours of apprenticeship. So I figuratively grew up over the store. So I did know the business. And my business school training, I think, was extraordinarily helpful in terms of coming to the company. The reason I was able to do that at such an early age is the strategy was ineffective. Yes. I didn't come to a company called Dunkin' Donuts, a universal food system, a portfolio of 8 disparate businesses. So I came with a sort of a knowledge about how to focus and change the strategy of the business.
Yes.
But fundamentally, how do you be long-lived? I think it's a journey. I think you got to be open. I think the average tenure of a CEO and maybe the Fortune 500 is probably 4 years.
That's true, yeah.
So 35 years is a long time. So part of it was I was lucky enough to have a father who started in the right industry, a business that was trends aligned, and I was able to recruit other classmates of mine to join me in the business. So I had wonderful teammates, and I think that basically I made some terrible mistakes, almost got fired once, but was able to rectify my mistakes, and basically kept trying to learn my trade. First, it was as running a small business, and as it kept changing, I kept learning from books and from seminars and from colleagues and consultants, basically how to continue to grow. And my advice to anybody else who wants to be long-lived is basically keep growing.
Yes.
And I get persistence. We had a lot of near-death experiences along the way.
Yeah. Many actually.
And I guess my other piece of advice is you really have to sort of love what you do. You have to love the business. You have to have a passion for it. You have to love the job. And I did. I loved my job. I loved my team. I loved the franchise owners. I liked the customers. It was something I loved. Someone said, if you have a job you love, you really never have to work a day in your life. I subscribe to that. I loved every day, but almost every day. It was a few days I didn't love it. Most days I did.
Well, I remember there was a period when you guys went into some training program with IBM and launched a haberdashery business. And I remember the insight you gave there, which is, you got to stick to what you know.
Well, fundamentally, when I came out of school, it was very clear I was going to take a portfolio of businesses that had really done too much exploitation, way beyond their capability, narrow it, focus on one business, fix the diamond in the rough that they had in their hands, which was Dunkin. Out of the 8 little businesses they had, over time, dispose of the others or close them down, sell some close, and just change the strategy. And we were incredibly successful the first 5 years. Remember, I was 25 years old. By the time I was 30, my father couldn't sell a business, my second year of business school, for $1.5 million.
That's right.
And by the time I was 30, we had a publicly owned company. And I was sitting on top of a company in those days that was worth $150 or $200 million market cap.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I basically then changed the strategy away from what we knew and decided that we weren't a focused donut and coffee company. We were now going to be a franchise business and spin out other franchise concepts.
Yes.
We had been growing earnings at 50% a year, and somehow in my young mind decided that was doable. Didn't realize that I could grow to the bigger than the gross national product in a few years if I kept that up. So I basically changed the mission and changed the set of objectives, and it was disastrous. And that's how I almost got fired. It basically, everything faltered. It was a mistake, and it taught us as a team, and me in particular, the importance of getting those planning issues right. What you want to be, what you want to have, which 4 or 5 key strategic levers you're going to pull to achieve that, ever scarce resources. And we learned that well, and we never looked back. But to learn that, we came to a real cliff. We almost fell into the abyss. And it shows when a leader gets it wrong, the impact on everybody is absolutely dramatic, just dramatic. So basically, a long-winded way of explaining a little bit what we did and where we came from, and why we were able to be long-lived. But I came very close to not making it, and neither did the business.
Why do you think the board backed you when the expansion didn't work? Why do you think they agreed to let you try to fix things?
Well, I think that the base of all human relationships, the glue that makes good relationships and things that work and those that don't, is whether or not an element of trust exists. And over time, I became more and more clear about how to build that trust. And I think that when I made the admission that we knew what we had done wrong and that all I required, in my opinion, we had really fixed a lot of the mistakes that we had made, was another quarter. And I fundamentally believe that we had. I believed I could be trusted, that I was being sincere, and I authentically believed that we could do it. And I think at the root of it, I think was the fact that we had, for the most part, delivered on our promises, and that we deserved to be trusted as a team. And they gave me another quarter. It was, in fact, true. We had identified the mistakes. I personally had identified my mistakes, which, by the way, came from a book. When I look back upon where the turn points were, and basically, I think it was the fact that we had established trust with the board and that they allowed us to go on. And I think franchisees too, because they had lost confidence a little bit in our leadership, in my leadership particularly. And I think it took a little bit of work to regain that. But the turn point for me really occurred sitting in my living room reading a book called The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam. It was a book about the Johnson and Kennedy administration's administration of the Vietnamese War. And even though the government officials that were administering the war were Ivy Leaguers who were the best and brightest that America had to offer, they never went into the hamlets and towns to find out really what the issues were among the townspeople. And the opposition was winning the hearts and minds of people. And Halberstam, the author, claimed that the difference really was something called hubris or arrogance. Mm-hmm. And sitting in that chair, it just struck me. I said, he could just as well be talking about me and us.
Yes.
And that was transformational for me. And that began a process of inviting people in to help us fix it, admission of what we had done wrong. And we began to work our way back. And that occurred before the board actually began to think about replacing me. So by that time, we had already taken all those steps to understand what the problem was. We decided right then and there that leadership's responsibility was never to blame the followership, to take not 50-50, but 100% of the responsibility. And that's what we did. And it stood us in good stead. And as I said, we never looked back on the next 30 years or so. We just kept going from strength to strength.
It's interesting that this book and this way of thinking had such a profound effect on you, because you can see that change in your mindset when you went to the Philippines, right? You were very open-minded about new ideas and thinking about them and exploiting them and building on them.
Yeah, that's true. And I think I was not served well by our early success. Remember, our Canada company was earning $100,000 in 1963.
Yeah.
When I took over, and by 1968, when we went public, we were making $700,000 or $800,000, and we were the third company to go public. And it was fast food and franchising were as attractive to the stock market in those days as high tech is today. And we were off and running, and that built in an awful lot of, I think, bad habits and wrong thinking and arrogance.
But I think what's interesting about the story is how each of the different stakeholders had to almost reset and understand their role. And the board could have very well have said, you know what, it's going to make us look good if we replace the CEO, but we're going to take a risk because we trust you and keep you. And obviously the franchisees, they were open to working with you. So it's interesting how so many different pieces had to work for the company to reset itself, and somehow everyone understood that and went forward with it.
But the basis of it is trust.
Yes. And I think in your book you mentioned you have a very...
And trust, as I detail in the book, there are 4 elements that create trust that I learned later in life. And those were in operation at the time. And sincerity, confidence, reliability, and care. Those are the 4 elements of trust. And we intuitively knew to do many of them. And we got better and better as time went on, as we became crisper about it.
Yes. And the interesting thing about this is that, you speak to any company in the world today, they all talk about they're sincere, they have competency, which is why people trust them, they're reliable, they care. But you only really know you have trust when you fail and see how people respond, right?
I think that's true. In times of trouble, you'll know.
In times of trouble, you'll know.
You'll know. And in times of trouble, people can tell if you authentically believe you have the answer. People are very perceptive in terms of reading your body language, and authenticity really is the coin of the realm, and that's what you're measured on. And if you believe to your core, then I think people might give you a second chance, and that's what happened with us.
Yeah, it's a very good example of, because a lot of the times when we think about leadership, we avoid examples of failure. And there's very few examples of a leader failing and then being given a chance and obviously earning the right to pick up the pieces and fix it. Normally, when you talk about success, it's someone who's continuously been successful. We don't know what would happen if they had faced some disaster where they never were given a chance to respond. And that's why this story for me is very interesting, because it's a very unique story in business, I think.
I think that basically most successful people who learn persistence often do it as a result of failing and not falling apart and persevering and learning as a result of that. I would bet if you pull the curtain back behind most lives that have turned out well, you'll find that because life is lumpy and business is lumpy. And I would suspect you'll find that people have faltered and fallen. And the comeback and resurrection is really the thing people cheer on, because it really is a part of life. It is the way you grow. You grow from a lot of pain.
Yes.
I think that, 35 years, you can make a lot of mistakes. And I did.
Yeah.
And that's how I learned, I think, as a result of those. Hopefully they weren't critical to the point where we lost the business or I lost my job. But boy, I kicked a lot of stones and had a lot of learning to do. And so I think you started off as, what's the lesson? The lesson is to persevere and keep learning. It's a long journey.
Yes.
And keep growing and keep learning. And it has its rewards.
America certainly loves a good comeback story.
I agree.
So in your book, when you start off, I expected you to talk a little bit about your father and your family. But what I didn't expect is that there's something like 60 pages dedicated to the background story, which is very interesting, right? But do you feel that the experiences your father had played a big role in terms of the difficulties, splitting up the businesses, buying out his brother-in-law, I think it was?
It shaped everything. In the early years, that's how I came to run the business at age 25. Basically, it came as a result of intense family conflict. And my father had a partner in an industrial feeding business. These sort of Meals on Wheels, these trucks that went around to small sites, construction sites, and small factories and offices. They were partners and they broke up. And my uncle took the then book value of the company, which was what we bought him out with, and began a competitive company called Mr. Donut. And my father, in turn, started to spin out other concepts like pancake houses and hamburger chains and cafeterias and vending machine companies. And so the company I took over was called Universal Food Systems. It wasn't called Dunkin Donuts. And Mr. Donut was winning the battle, or at least they were the same size in '63. When I got there, we had 100 Dunkin' stores and they had 80 Mr. Donut stores. And my uncle was getting acknowledged for being a sort of a pioneer of a brand new part of the fast food industry. He was driving my father crazy. My father's an 8th grade educated guy, very proud, very strong. And the strategy was not the right strategy to win. And he wasn't quite sure what to do. He tried to hire an executive vice president and he tried to sell the business. And he couldn't write the strategy. They couldn't fix it. They were dealing in tactics, not strategy. And he turned to a 25-year-old son and said, "See if you can fix it." And that's how at 25 I got the job. And my dad and I are very different people. He's an 8th grade educated guy, bigger than all outdoors, and a big personality. A child of the Depression. He lived through experiences and scarring that I never faced. He was always trying to sell a business. I thought he was trying to build it. And trying to promise him we'd go public. The reason we went public so fast was to keep it from being sold. He had never had any money, and he had a different life experience and a different style. He was a tough guy and a real hustler, and he had an inspirational life, but a different one, and a different story to tell. And so that had its own challenges as time went on. So yes, the early years were very much shaped by that, and that did help shape how we turned out.
What's interesting about this story is that when people want to learn about strategy and operations, there's this enormous emphasis on the analytics. How do you do a net present value calculation, look at competitor profiles and market segmentation, all those things you guys were doing. But we tend to shortchange the impact our life experiences have on us in the way we interpret the data and the subsequent decisions we make. I mean, when your dad brought you in, you were both looking at the same data, but you had a very different interpretation of what to do with the business.
Absolutely. And it becomes hard. And this is true in most young people who join family businesses as they pass from generation to generation. you oftentimes, in order to survive and to succeed, you have to alter the business in very dramatic ways.
Yes.
In our case, it was basically redo the whole strategy of the business and change even the name. We went public. I took over Universal Food Systems in '63, but went public with Dunkin Donuts in '68, 5 years later.
Wow.
It was a whole different business. And we had, a lot of it is emotion.
Yes.
The donut wars between Mr. Donut and Dunkin' Donuts.
The
I
donut
cannot tell you
wars.
how that shaped our conversation, our actions, our activities, the things that I had to pay attention to, and how it led us down blind alleys, and sometimes on how it spurred us on until we ultimately won the donut wars. But it was very much, emotionally driven business between family members.
Yes. How did your father respond to the changes when they were being made and after the successes of the changes?
I don't think it was so much, we didn't have a lot of differences in terms of strategy.
Mm-hmm.
It tended to be more one of both style and also, I think, of objectives. I think, he wanted to equitize. He wanted cash, and I wanted to build. So there were the brush points. My dad was more, I think, command and control. I remember he gave me a book about, the name might not mean anything to you, but Al Dunlop, the guy, Chainsaw Al Dunlop.
Oh, yeah, I know him.
And wrote a book called Mean Business. And
yes,
that was sort of the style of how he saw business. He saw kind of this win-lose, no win-win. I mean, we just had different styles and different life experiences. And that's pretty true often of people, and sometimes of generations. So I don't remember huge disagreements on strategy. Pretty much he left that to me. And it was working out well. We vanquished the competition. We went public. Within 5 years, he didn't have the $1 million after tax as a millionaire. He walked away with $4.5 million, and he still owned almost 50% of the company. And so it was working well for him. But he still, clung to the fact that maybe we should cash out. Maybe it's time. Maybe we'll lose it all. And that was a constant strain between us. But those exist in all families, I'm sure.
Yes. There's a lot of lessons here that we don't see in typical businesses, because most business success stories is about a corporation, but you rarely see examples of franchises with family businesses and so on. So I have to ask the question, Bob, your family, kids or grandkids, are they involved in the donut business or the catering or the hotel business?
No, they're not, unfortunately. None of them are.
None of them are. So nobody has gone into the family business.
None have gone into the family business. It's bad. The family business is no longer a family
business.
That's
true, right?
We went public in '68. We had a hostile takeover in '89, '90, and we're taken over by a large English company that I continued to work through that to make sure that we were safe with a white knight through a hostile takeover, which is all contained in the book.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, the business has really migrated into a professionally managed business. Successive management teams have taken the foundation that we built in the 35 years and have gone from strength to strength and improved and grown the business dramatically and internationalized the business, taken it from around the corner to around the world. So no, my children are all in different businesses.
So where do you think Dunkin' Donuts can go next? I mean, what do you think are the things that are happening in the world today? What are the big trends that are shaping business?
I think digitization spells the difference. I remember when I first joined the restaurant industry way back in '63. So, God, how many years ago? That's 60-some years ago or more. Basically, there were about 500,000 restaurants in the United States. And when I retired, my recollection was there were about 500,000 restaurants in almost 2000. Close to when I retired. I retired, I think, in '98 from day-to-day management of the business and had a second career. So, but they have basically gone from mom and pops into individual chains, mostly franchise chains. And today, I think, particularly with the pandemic, it has accelerated the trends that were already in effect, which are basically those companies that had and understood and could afford to build digital platforms, understand consumer relationship marketing, understood ordering by telephone, paying by phone, all of the things that come along with the new digital age. Those are the ones that are going to thrive. So There are individual mom and pop restaurants that are closing today, and people are, decrying, what's going to happen to the restaurant industry. In my view, this might have occurred maybe over the next 10 years or so. It just seems that it's happening faster, that the chains that are large, resourceful, that understand this will pick up the slack, will open up operations, and will thrive. So unfortunately, the big will get bigger, and I think, but not so unfortunately, I think basically the consumer benefits from that.
Yes.
I think franchisees benefit from that. So I think the public is actually better served.
Yes.
The notion is romantic that we like our old pizza parlor where they made pizza. But the fact of the matter is that the ability to be able to order online. I was a director at Domino's for 14 years. Our ability to digitize and capture that market, and I think has been a huge benefit and boon to the consumer as well as to the franchisees and to the company and to the stockholders that own the company. So they're actually, I think we're migrating constantly toward larger and larger platforms and companies, but I don't think people are really disturbed by that. Unfortunately, there will be some independents that will falter. But in those cases, in our case, we tried to convert local bakeries and other people to Dunkin' Donuts franchises. They weren't that receptive, but that is a way for them to participate, to join in concert with existing large brand name firms that have the know-how and the resources to be able to play in this new era.
So, it's not a good way to think about it this way, but this pandemic is almost like a forest fire. It's going to force the ones who, for whatever reason, are not strong enough to survive. Some of them are going to fall, but it's going to create space for new players in the market and the ones who are ready to thrive, right?
I think that's right. It just accelerated everything.
Yes.
I think the trends were there to begin with. And there is room. You asked the question earlier. There is room for brand new innovation, new ways to come to market, things that I'm not aware of. I mean, out of nowhere came Chipotle with a new service delivery system where they were able to customize your meal and a platform line. I didn't conceive of that, but boy, when I saw it, I said, my God, this is, it's just a service delivery system change. And look what they've created. And they can do the same thing now with Chinese food that they did with south of the border fare.
Yeah.
They can do it with other product as well. So, I mean, it's hard to tell where someone's going to pop up with a fabulous idea. But that's all this was. What Chipotle did, for the most part, they made a big deal out of sourcing locally, which got them in trouble, I think.
Yeah.
And they had a lot of health issues. But the real thing, as I saw it, was the fact that they had a new service delivery system. They could customize a bowl or a burrito or whatever you wanted and still provide for instantaneous service. So they still provided convenience and value, and they could customize it. And it was a big innovation. And I'm here to tell you that there will be other new ones that we can't foresee right now that will come on the scene from scratch with these kind of innovative ideas.
Well, that's the great thing about capitalism, for lack of a better word. It's all about having the right idea and having, as you mentioned several times, you got to have that perseverance to see through failures and just stick at it, and eventually it will work.
I think that's true. I agree with you.
Are there any books or anything that you would recommend that is helping you think through what's happening in digitization and the changes in the economy?
Not so much anymore. My days as a board member now retired, so I'm reading much more about things. The book that's on my bookshelf now is really Clay Christensen's book about how do you measure life.
Oh, wow.
So I'm now I'm now in my fourth career. I'm beginning to start to think through an idea that I dusted off from years ago. And I was in the chairs to become chairman of the International Franchise Association. And after the riots of 1968, thought that enterprise zones made a lot of sense, so you could combine complementary groups of franchise businesses in underserved markets owned by minorities. And I think the time is right. That idea had SBA backing from me when I first floated it years ago, but I ran into a lot of distrust in the community. So I think it may be right to dust it off. And so I'm gearing myself more toward what's next for me after the book is published, and I can then move on to my next project. And that's the one. So I'm gearing myself for that. So that's where my focus tends to be.
Well, that's pretty interesting. So I look forward to your next book and how you made all of this work, and we'll do another podcast on that.
I look forward to that.
Thank you, Bob. It was an absolute pleasure to speak to you.
Same here. Thank you so much.
Take care. Enjoy your time watching the ocean, and we'll let you know when we're about to publish this.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing the episode. Finally, I want you to remember that the only way to get access to our special offers, the only way to get our special pricing, and the only way to get samples of our content is to join the list on firmsconsulting.com. It's the only way also to get access to our unique advanced content that we make available to insiders. So if you want to get a sneak peek of things, test it out, see what's in there, this is the place to go. And finally, I want to thank you again for making us one of the largest podcast channels around the world for careers and for the 2 million downloads and counting.